appreciate the worship that we shared this morning and the thoughtfulness that so many people have put in to make it meaningful for all of us. For those of you who've been following the reading that we've been tracing our way through the book of Acts, you'll know that in Acts chapter 15, the one that we had read to us this morning, there were two main areas of conflict. The first was the disagreement between Christians who were Jews and those who were not about the need of circumcision. And if you look through the church paper this morning, you'll see an outline of how that was dealt with and considered at the time. The other disagreement was a personal one, a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. When we have disagreements over doctrinal matters, it's great to be able to go to an authority and have a resolution of the issue. And that's what was done in the case of the question of circumcision. But when it came to a personal issue, it was an issue that needed to be dealt with by the individuals. And that's always the case. I'm glad to be able to talk on this subject this morning when we don't have division within our church, because we can establish some principles that make it clear that we're not pointing the bone at any particular individual or individuals, but taking to heart certain principles that will help us when time of division might come to pass. This particular dispute that occurred involves three people, three individuals of strong character. The first was Barnabas, second was Paul, and the third, not so prominent, was John, also known as Mark. I want to take a few minutes to just trace the background of each of these people very quickly, going through from where we first hear of them in the book of Acts to the events that led to this particular time. The first time we hear about Barnabas is recorded in Acts chapter 4 and verse 36. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means the son of encouragement, sold a field that he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. The background to this was that in the early days of the Christian church, when so many people had gathered in Jerusalem for the Jewish feast of Pentecost, the time that involved those who were there was much longer than they initially intended. And you can imagine what it's like when there's an airport closed down and people get stuck in a place and have to look for immediate accommodation and care. That's exactly what happened in this case. Many people needed to be shown Christian hospitality, and what Barnabas did, along with other people, was gave very freely and kindly. And that's the beginning of our association with him. We see him a little later mentioned in Acts chapter 9 and verse 26. And this is where he came into contact with the Apostle Paul. I'm going to talk about Paul in a few moments, but Paul came to Jerusalem under some great distress. He had to leave Damascus under very difficult circumstances. And when he got to Jerusalem, he wasn't given a ready welcome by the people there amongst whom he wanted to mix, because they thought he was still that person who'd gone out to persecute the Christians and have those Jewish people, those people who were not Jews, who wanted to be part of the Christian faith, or the Jews who disagreed with those who on the issue of circumcision. He wanted to round them up and have them dealt with under the law of the land, the Jewish time, in Jewish times. And when he came to Jerusalem, Paul found himself afloat and probably ostracised by almost everybody within the Christian community. But when he came, he tried to join the disciples, it says in Acts 9, and found that outcome as I've described. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and told them all about Paul's conversion experience and his experience witnessing for Jesus forcibly and thoroughly in Damascus. And so they opened the doors to Paul, and he found himself comfortable in their environment, mainly with the help of Barnabas at the instigation of that relationship. Paul stayed with them a long time, but it wasn't too much time after that circumstances eventually climaxed for Paul in another debate that was an extension of this same issue of circumcision amongst the Jews. And this time he was in dispute with the Hellenists, that's Jewish people with a Greek culture. And when the apostles saw how things were developing, they decided to take Paul down to the nearest port and send him back to his hometown at Damascus, at Tarsus. So once again, Paul had been shipwrecked, away from things, but in both circumstances, Paul had been cared for by a particular Christian, and especially Barnabas. We see eventually, as we move on into chapter 11, that as the Christian church began to grow and came under persecution at the time soon after the stoning of Stephen, that a big concentration of Christians began to form at Antioch. It was easier for them to be there, away from the centre of conflict, and many Christians were added to the church from a non-Jewish background. And so, as this concentration of people became a handful for the leaders of the church, while there was good news about the Lord Jesus being taught, and the Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord, the apostles in Jerusalem thought, well, we've got to do something about trying to get some organisation and promote the development that has begun. So what they did at that stage was they called for Barnabas, and Barnabas went from Jerusalem to Antioch, and he became a focal point, leading the church with the express guidance of the apostles from Jerusalem. It wasn't long before Barnabas found the situation was a little more than he could handle. So what he did was he hot potatoed down to Tarsus. He got Paul and he brought him back to Antioch, and they began to work together. And the story about the outcome of that is recorded in Acts chapter 11, where it says that Barnabas was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. And when Paul had brought Barnabas to join him, a great number of people further were added to the disciples, and it was there that the church or Christians disciples first became known as Christians. So we see the development that has happened with the spread of the early church and the formation of established groups and relationships between Christians was fostered by the leaders in the church at Jerusalem, but by Barnabas as a principal factor in all of that. We turn now to Paul, and we hear of him first of all in Acts chapter 9. And you remember the story that Paul had gone to Damascus, hell-bent on persecuting those new believers who had dared to leave the Jewish faith. And he was rounding them up and having them put in jail or brought into trial and so forth. And eventually he was met by Jesus on the road to Damascus in a dramatic way, left blind, wondering what was all happening to himself. And the Lord said in a vision to a man by the name of Ananias, I want you to go down to the straight street in this town and find this man Paul. He has a vision of somebody, namely you, who's going to come and give him his sight. Ananias was saying to himself, well, this is not right. This is the fellow who's going to present all sorts of problems for Christians, as he has been in the past. I'm not going to be part of this. And God said, look, Ananias, go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. So Ananias went, of course, and then Paul, after he had been established in his relationship with God through this intercession with Ananias, he began to work in the city of Damascus, sharing his faith and, as a new convert, helping others come to the same faith that he'd come to himself. Of course, he was in trouble. Soon as that began to be the case, those whom he was previously persecuting were out for his skin. And so he had to leave Damascus. And when he left Damascus, he came down to Jerusalem, as we said before, and that's where the relationship began with Paul in his contact with Barnabas. Things went pretty well for a while until there was this famine in Jerusalem. And when the new disciples in Antioch found how badly the impact of that was upon the people in Jerusalem, they took their hats around and took up a collection to send it down to Jerusalem to bring what we would call social benefits. The sort of benefits that provided by our government today was provided by Christians at that time. Who should they send it with? But by Paul and Barnabas. So they went down to Jerusalem, and when they'd done what they had to do, they returned to Antioch. And in the days that followed, things seemed to be going pretty well. Paul again was coupled with Barnabas to go back to Jerusalem to deal with the issue that we covered last 2 weeks ago in Acts chapter 15, this question of circumcision. In every case, Barnabas that is mentioned after his early days is mentioned in association with Paul. But then it came to the stage where, having been commissioned by the church to take what we call the first Christian, the first worldwide Christian mission, having come back successfully and reported to the church at Antioch at how things had gone so well, they were spending a good time together just fellowshipping with the rest of the Christians at Antioch until Barnabas again took the fore and he said to Paul, why don't we go back and retrace our steps and go through the places where we've been and reinforce the faith of those we've led to faith. And that's the background of what I want to say is this dispute that caused them to be parted and separated in friendship as well. The problem centred around another man we know as Mark, or John Mark. He's the young fellow you might remember who, when Jesus was taken to be tried, he was following behind in the crowd. And when the powers that be were there, saw him, they grabbed him by all that he was wearing, and that was a blanket of some sort, and he's the young man who fled naked from that circumstance. It's the first thing we hear about Mark. But later on we hear that when Paul and Barnabas had gone down to Jerusalem, they brought John Mark back with them. And when the church at Antioch, when the Holy Spirit commissioned Paul and Barnabas through the leaders of the church there, they laid their hands on Paul and Barnabas and sent them on their way for that first missionary tour. John Mark went along with them as well. But when we come to Acts chapter 13, it seems it's just a few days after the beginning of that missionary tour to Perga in Pamphylia, that's on the mainland, and that's where John Mark left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know very much about what the dispute was over, nor for that matter what it was that John Mark did or didn't do that caused Paul to be and Barnabas in dispute. But if we understand what is happening at the particular time, we know that in the history of the Christian church at this time, there was no such thing as a printed Bible. As a matter of fact, there wasn't even a New Testament at all. And all the people had was a written copy of the Old Testament that might have been kept in synagogues. So when people were converted, as Paul and Barnabas were principally responsible for, somebody needed to do the work that was involved in what we call discipling new Christians. And that's a function that needs to be done every time someone comes to faith in Jesus. Mark would have had the responsibility to do this by indoctrination, by repeating things by rote, where people would have been encouraged to recite the things that they were taught so that they could remember them. Never written anywhere. And so when Mark fell down in this responsibility, Paul and Barnabas must have boxed on the best they could on that first missionary tour without him. But when it came to the point of starting again on that journey to repeat what had been done before, Paul wasn't going to go with Mark because he let him down before. Barnabas, on the other hand, was this man full of grace and kindness, the son of encouragement, stood up for Mark. And I love the character of this man, because in the circumstances he made a significant difference that we can see in the New Testament later on in its records. But even if we didn't see those things, it's important for us to recognise that when these two good men of God fell out amongst one another, they didn't do what often happens in such circumstances. They didn't do what they did incessantly. They didn't cause people to form up in groups and support on one of the other. They each decided to pursue what it was that God gave them to do individually. Paul went off, as the rest of the book of Acts tells us, to circulate around the area around the Mediterranean where the Jewish beliefs have been relayed. He built on that and led people to faith. And so as a consequence of that, we not only have the book of Acts and the rest of book of Acts talking all about Paul and his ministry, but we hear and we read Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, places where Paul had gone to witness and had now sent letters enunciating the faith that he wanted these people to be able to treasure and apply. And we have them available to us today because he did that. And then, of course, There was the two letters that were sent to the church at Corinth, and finally the letter of Paul to the Romans. This is about a half of our New Testament. And so you might say, as we see how this dispute unfolded, that it seems as though God favoured Paul. He did what God wanted him to do, and he was successful. And we might stop at that point and say, well, that suggests that when we come to disputes, we pick the person who's the most logical and we support him, put the other fellow to one side. That's not what happened. The story tells us that Paul left Barnabas and went to those countries on the mainland around the Mediterranean. But then it says, just very simply, Barnabas went to his hometown of Cyprus where he lived, and he took John Mark with him. And because we don't have a record of what happened in Barnabas' life thereafter, we don't know how things developed, but we can draw some conclusions. You see, Barnabas had John Mark under his wing, and John Mark, you remember, was the person who went back, who is a turncoat. He didn't do what he was called to do. But when Barnabas spent time with John Mark, the consequences for us today is what we now know as the Gospel of Mark. Had Barnabas not fulfilled the role that he had from God, we wouldn't have that gospel. Mark would not have returned to the Lord. And we have in his gospel, as a matter of fact, there are more instances of the miracles that Jesus performed in his gospel than there are in any other one of the gospel records. Further to that, when we get to the end of Paul's life, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, we hear Paul talking about the end of his life and the certainty that age or opposition was catching up with him. I'm already poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. And then sadly and soberly he says that Demas has forsaken me and gone to Thessalonica, and Crestus has gone to Galatia, and Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me now. But when you come, make sure you bring that cloak that I left behind somewhere. And while you're doing that, bring John Mark with you, because he's helpful me in my ministry. And as I think that through, I realise that we have a lesson in just this dispute of two people that points us to this. We first of all need to recognise that if we allow dispute to fester, it will divide us over time and it will cause us to be parted. On the other hand, if we don't allow dispute to foster in such a way, but look for an open door for each of the individuals that are involved, we can allow God to do what God can do to bring success and significant progress in the life of every individual. For me, it's a wonder for me to have the New Testament with the writings of Paul. And without that, I wouldn't have the concerted theology and doctrine that allows me to understand how to live the Christian life. But isn't it wonderful for us to have the life, those last 3 years of Jesus' life, to guide us and lead us to know where our salvation begins? If we would allow people to find their feet where it's best to them to find their feet, go their own way, with God guiding and leading to his fulfilment in their lives, the end result will be so much better than if we allowed division to foster and divide us. These are lessons that are always good to learn when we don't have division, because then we're not pointing these points out about anybody to their advantage or disadvantage. But in our mind, we're preparing ourselves to see how God's work can foster when we don't allow division to divide us.